Hi, friends. Thank you for joining me on this Awesomely Austen April. We are going to spend the month reading all of Jane Austen's books, brought to you by the Awesomely Austen series. I love these series. I think you're really going to enjoy them as well. Our first book is going to be Sense and Sensibility, which is brought to you this version by Joanna Nadin and Eglantine Ceulemans. So we're going to read the first 7 chapters today. Now, I hope that you saw our character guide on Facebook so you have an idea of who everybody is. If not, it's still available for you to check out. Chapter 1. In life, Mr. Henry Dashwood adored all his children equally. There was John, his firstborn, whose heart was, at least originally, in the right place, but who was too easily led by his wife, Fanny Dashwood. Her selfish and greedy ways soon rubbed off on him. Then there were his 3 eldest daughters. Sensible Elinor, whose calm demeanor and wisdom balanced out her slightly flighty mother, Mrs. Dashwood, Henry's second wife and John's stepmother. Then there was Marianne, whose romantic sensibilities led her to either weeping or shrieking with delight on an almost daily basis. Last of all came Margaret, who, at 13, was still of an age where she found the rules of society somewhat odd, not least the one that dictated that despite her father's equal affection, when he died he had to leave his entire estate, their beloved home of Norland, to John, on account of him being male and therefore somehow more deserving. Not his entire estate, pointed out Elinor. We have £1,000 each. Well, who's going to marry us on that? Protested Marianne. We're practically paupers. Their mother sighed in agreement. Not quite paupers, said Elinor. And anyway, I thought true love didn't care about income or status. I suppose, begrudged Marianne, recalling her own words from a month before. But I still don't think it's fair that John gets the house. Not when he already has one in London, said Margaret, still weighing up the injustice of it all. So we have Marianne, Elinor, Margaret, and Mrs. Dashwood. Well, perhaps he won't want it, suggested Elinor, ever the peacekeeper. Perhaps we shall be able to stay as long as we want. That would be fair, I think. Perhaps John hadn't sought Norland for himself, but the decision, alas, wasn't up to him alone, and fairness was not in his wife's vocabulary, as Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters were about to find out. Chapter 2. No sooner had Fanny received news that John had inherited the Norland estate, the family's bags were packed, and she, her husband, and their son, the overly doted-on Henry, set out for Norland, which Fanny was already referring to as their country residence. Of course, there will need to be alterations, she declared as the carriage clattered its way from London to Sussex. Improvements, too. It's so very outdated, after all. And the dust! What the servants do all day, I am quite at a loss to know. Yes, dear, agreed John, though he wasn't at all clear what he was agreeing to, lost as he was in his own thoughts of inheritance. Perhaps I should give them another 1,000 apiece, he mused out loud. That would be generous, wouldn't it? I think it would look good. £1,000 each? Fanny's face paled. That's 3,000 less a year for precious Henry. Rob your own boy, would you? John shrank. Well, now that you put it like that, he thought again. 500 each? Papa did ask me to make sure they were all right once he was no longer around. He'd probably lost his senses when he said that. He was ill after all. And what will they want with the money when they move to a modest house? There'll be no need for horses, for servants. And when they marry, whose hands will our money be in? Yes, quite right, admitted John. Good. As ever, Fanny got the last word, as within moments the carriage turned up the sweeping drive to Norland, and all members of the party fell silent at the sight of the house that was now theirs by law, however unfair that might seem to some. So we have Fanny and John and little Henry, and there's Norland. It's very big, very pretty, which is why they While John, Fanny, and Henry were delighted at their arrival, the Dashwoods were quite put out, not least by the fact that Fanny hadn't even given them notice. Notice? she repeated, handing her umbrella and gloves to a servant, others bustling behind them, carrying their mini bags. To our own residence? How absurd. The truth, if it hadn't hit them already, was now as clear as a crystal champagne glass. The Dashwoods were rendered visitors in their own home. Even Mrs. Dashwood, who saw the good in everyone, and was usually so tolerant of fools, sometimes to a worrying degree, seethed at the sudden injustice. The nerve of her, she snapped, complaining about the dust. I heard her say she's going to get rid of the library on account of it, cried Marianne. Papa's books! And she began to sob. Heathen, agreed Margaret, passing Marianne a handkerchief. Only Elinor was able to keep her fury in check. There's no point in getting cross, she said calmly. We have to plan, and that means finding a new house. At that, both Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne cried out. But the truth was upon them, and once she had dried her eyes, Mrs. Dashwood did begin to plan, discussing over the coming days details of houses she thought she might be able to tolerate. Once again, Elinor had to play wise parent. Mamma, these are all fine houses, but they are beyond our means. We are reduced now, and must cut our cloth accordingly. You'd have us live in a hovel, protested Marianne. I shouldn't mind, said Margaret. I'd rather a hovel than live with Fanny any longer. And besides, think of the adventure. I don't want an adventure, wailed Marianne. I want my piano and my horse. Not a hovel, corrected Elinor. A cottage. You can't keep a horse at a cottage, pointed out Marianne. No, agreed Elinor, but we can live comfortably and, more importantly, together. In this, at least, they were in agreement. Chapter 3. Elinor was still sifting through sketches of prospective cottages, hoping that her mother wouldn't refuse all of them, when Fanny exercised her newfound status as lady of the house by announcing that her brother was coming to stay. Which one? Asked Elinor, having knowledge of two men as unalike, it was widely reported, as a pea and a peppercorn. Edward, said Fanny, not that it matters. But matter it did, and a great deal. For Edward Ferrars was a far different prospect from Robert, a fool and a show-off if there ever was one. And from his sister Fanny, too. Where Fanny, taking after her mother, enjoyed money and craved even more of it, Edward did not care for either career or fortune. All he'd ever wanted to do was become a vicar in a quiet country village, an idea that antagonized his family enormously. The Dashwoods, however, warmed to him the moment he arrived. Such a kind man, declared Mrs. Dashwood. And rich, said Margaret, though he doesn't boast about it at all. The church, though? Said Marianne, baffled by the prospect. His mother wants him to go into Parliament, said Elinor, who had been discussing the said matter with him only this morning, but he cannot bear the idea. Well, he's too old for the army, said Mrs. Dashwood. And not smart enough for the navy, said Elinor. That was his joke, though he is wrong, of course. Mr. Edward Ferrars, kind-hearted and generous. He wants to become a vicar. Marianne pulled a face. He's hardly handsome, though, and so awkward. When he reads aloud, it's as dull as the worst kind of sermon. He's just shy, retorted Elinor, surprised at her own defensiveness, and wondering what to make of it. Surely her mother was as well. Her dear mother, driven, as many were of her gender, by the prospect of a good match, had done exactly that, and found to her delight that Elinor was obviously falling in love. She hoped that Edward would too, given enough time, and so she dallied further over choosing a cottage, endeavoring to keep Elinor in Edward's company as long as she could, ignoring the bickering of her daughters, who could still not agree over his either virtues or Elinor's affection. His taste is so unrefined, complained Marianne. He has no ear for music, and though he claims to like your sketches, it's only because they're yours, not because he understands why they're good. Well, doesn't that recommend him? Replied Elinor. Doesn't it highlight his generosity, his kindness? Well, yeah. But as for him having no understanding, I find him highly educated in all of the arts, with a love of books and a lively imagination. I didn't say I didn't like him, said Marianne, sensing her sister's irritation. He's just not the perfect specimen I imagined you with. Though I suppose no man may be. And of course, if you love him, I shall love him. Elinor paled. I didn't say I loved him. Well, what then? She searched for the word and plucked it like a plum, albeit a small one. Esteem him. Esteem him? Yes, I like him. I don't deny it. Esteem? Repeated Marianne. Like? These are cold-hearted words. No, worse. It's as if you're ashamed of even having feelings at all. Elinor blushed. We cannot all be as passionate in our language as you, dear Marianne. And besides, I have no proof of his feelings for me. Not yet. She thought for a moment. I mean, I sense he feels the same. But even if he were inclined, he is by no means independent. I suspect his mother would make it quite difficult for him if he wanted to marry a woman with neither rank nor fortune. Which is what we are now, both of us. No, she added, as if reassuring herself of the rightness of this. It's safer this way. Safer to esteem. And safer it was. For the moment Fanny got wind of the budding friendship between her beloved brother and less than beloved sister-in-law, she took great pains to point out to Mrs. Dashwood the express demands of her mother, Mrs. Ferris, that Edward should marry a woman of equal or increased status, and woe betide any unsuitable woman who tried to lure him in. Enraged, but also concerned for her eldest daughter, Mrs. Dashwood vowed not to spend a single day longer than necessary under the same roof as this meddling and cruel woman, and to find virtue in one of Elinor's depressing cottages. But living in such proximity to Norland would surely pain all of them, to see their former home so close, yet so untouchable. It is no wonder, then, that when a letter arrived the very next morning from a distant cousin, Sir John Middleton, offering her a humble cottage on his Devonshire estate, some 100 and more miles away, she grasped at the opportunity as if it were a palace. Chapter 4. It was with relief, if not something approaching gloating, that Mrs. Dashwood informed her stepson and his wife that they would inconvenience them at Norland no longer. "Where is this cottage?" demanded Fanny, knowing full well where, having been told only a minute previously. "Devonshire," replied Mrs. Dashwood. "Barton Park, to be precise." "It's terribly far," said Fanny. "Too far for most to visit, I should think." "Not for our real friends," replied Mrs. Dashwood, with an obvious nod to Edward, whose expression at the dinner table was equal in pallor and shock to Elinor's. Fanny bristled. "How many rooms does it have? The girls will have to share, I presume." "Only if they choose," said Mrs. Dashwood. "I wouldn't mind sharing," replied Margaret, thinking of the secrets to be earwigged if she were in permanent proximity to her sisters. "Well, let's see, shall we?" said Elinor. "No room for horses, of course," said Fanny. "Henry can have captain." Marianne let out a yelp. "But he's mine!" "You can't possibly stable him now, nor afford a groom." "No, best left to Henry." Fanny smiled at her son, who was oblivious, shoveling his third helping of pudding. "When are you leaving?" asked John. "As soon as we're packed," said Mrs. Dashwood. "We'll be taking the china, of course, and our linen." Fanny stiffened. "It is ours by right," Elinor stated. "Papa's wishes." "Of course," said Fanny. "I had planned to replace it all anyway, because most of it's chipped or threadbare." There was nothing of the sort, but neither Elinor nor Mrs. Dashwood sought to correct her. Instead, they delighted silently in the injury, however small, to Fanny's fortune. "Tom will join us too," said Mrs. Dashwood, "and Betsy." Fanny recovered. "I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm sure I can spare 2 servants, considering I have so many here." Mrs. Dashwood smiled. "You're too kind." Her daughters knew Fanny was anything but. However, not one of them said a word, finishing the meal in quiet contemplation of their fast-changing fate. Margaret thinking of the adventures to be had in the woods and the potential pirates on the sea, which was less than a mile from their new home. Marianne imagining the suitors she might meet, the parties she might attend, the inspiration and nature she might gain from such a situation. and Elinor telling herself that separation from Edward was inevitable, and for the best if she thought about it. And if he visited, well, that was neither here nor there. It did not matter to her. Only. Chapter 5. The Dashwoods' departure following the Tuesday, the 1st in September, was, however, anything but silent, as Mrs. Dashwood was forced to say goodbye to her happy marital home, and the girls to their childhood one. Marianne was, as ever, the main source of commotion. "Oh, dear, dear Norland," she wailed, as the carriage made its way through the park to the gates. "You cannot know how much I suffer to leave you." And on she went, lamenting the trees, the branches, the individual leaves which had given her shade. "There will be trees in Devonshire," pointed out Elinor. But at that Marianne wailed louder, the Devonshire trees assumedly not half as expansive, as tall, as green as these beloved ones. Elinor did not try to comfort her again with words, but took her sister's hand in her own, and in the other her mother's, as they began their long and melancholy way to their new life. As they approached Barton Park the following morning, though the spirits of all four were lifted, for who could not be moved by the view across a lush valley, the sparkle of the sea in the distance, the cheery disposition of the villagers going about their daily business, unaware as they were of the Dashwoods' misfortune. The cottage itself was not to disappoint either, though it was small indeed compared to Norland, and had neither the green shutters nor the honeysuckle around the door that Marianne had desperately imagined. It did have a neat wicket gate, a perfectly serviceable set of rooms, and enough beds for them to accommodate a guest, should one, such as Edward perhaps, happen to call, though that did not prevent Mrs. Dashwood from immediately imagining improvements and extensions as soon as her income allowed. "Perhaps in the spring, if I have plenty of money, which I dare say I shall, I may think about building. Imagine the parties we could give if only the parlors were joined." "Perhaps," agreed Elinor, knowing full well, as did Mrs. Dashwood, that their fortune was as fictitious as unicorns. But despite this, she joined in the raptures as the family took in their new home. At that very moment it was bathed in the late summer sun, turning it the color of honey, and set about it with charming plants still in full leaf. Of course, not one of them wondered for a moment how cold it might plummet to midwinter, how isolated they might become. No, right now Barton College had proved an excellent prospect, and they felt indebted to Mrs. Dashwood's cousin, Sir John, for his generosity. "Will we meet him soon?" asked Margaret, as she unpacked her precious treasure, a novel involving pirates, as usual, a lucky rabbit's foot that Marianne could not bear to look upon without imagining the poor creature that died to make it, and a fur comb. "Soon," confirmed her mother, busy with linen. "Careful!" called Marianne, who was occupied in ensuring her piano was positioned for just where she wanted it, not an entirely easy matter for Tom and his assistant from the village, given how much furniture was already taking up space, and how little room there was to maneuver. "Delivery for Mrs. Dashwood," came another call from the door. Elinor went to fetch it, since her mother was occupied with soothing Marianne, and was surprised to discover not the postman, but none other than Sir John himself. "I do hope I'm not intruding," he bellowed, "but I did want to see that you were settled in." "Well, not quite," said Elinor truthfully, "but I'm sure it won't take long. Until then you must dine with us every night." "Oh, we couldn't," began Mrs. Dashwood, who, alerted to a cacophony louder than Marianne's, had rushed to greet her cousin. "I insist," asserted Sir John loudly, so that neither Mrs. Dashwood nor Elinor could bring themselves to deny him. "Besides, Lady Middleton is so very keen to meet you." "Oh, well, good, good," Sir John agreed. "I'll send something on as well, to keep you going until then." "Oh, nothing too big," pleaded Elinor. "Just a mere trifle," Sir John insisted again. He was a very insistent man, as so many are. It was not, of course, a mere trifle, but rather a large basket of fruit and vegetables from Barton Park's own orchards and kitchen garden, followed in less than an hour by a brace of pheasants. "Paupers," laughed Elinor, shaking her head as she recalled Marianne's past comment. But Marianne didn't hear her. She was too busy on her well-placed piano, lost in the lilt of the music, which, to her relief, sounded the same in Devonshire as it had in Sussex. her fingers dancing in and out of bright slice of country sunlight that fell on the keys. Chapter 6. Sir John and Lady Middleton complimented each other well. Where he was loud and brash, she was only a woman of few words. Where he liked only to hunt, she liked only to dote on their 4 children. Where he loved nothing more than to host extravagant parties, she prided herself on the elegance of the table settings. A good thing, too, as Barton Park, a mere half-mile from the cottage, was rarely without several guests. At the Dashwoods' first visit there were, however, only 2. After Sir John had greeted the women loudly and enthusiastically, he lowered his tone to apologize. He had, he told them, tried to muster up some others from the neighborhood, but at such short notice everyone was otherwise engaged, so they would have to do with one Colonel Brandon, who was sadly neither very young nor a party sort, and Lady Middleton's mother, Mrs. Jennings, who would likely make up for Colonel Brandon's lack of gaiety, as partying was practically her profession. Sir John was not wrong. Colonel Brandon was a silent and serious man, and Mrs. Jennings, despite her age, quite the life and soul of this and every party, from Devonshire to Dulwich, from where she brought all manner of gossip. But whatever their misgivings, the Dashwoods warmed to both, if only to spite Lady Middleton, who had rather too much in common with Fanny Dashwood, and enjoyed a splendid evening. Marianne, most of all, who discovered Lady Middleton's long-abandoned piano, and set about playing the sheet music that had sat patiently awaiting this day for more than a decade. While Mrs. Dashwood clapped and Mrs. Jennings and Sir John, 2 peas in a pod, cheered, Elinor noticed that Colonel Brandon sat in silence, entranced by the music, or perhaps its player. For better or worse, Elinor was not the only one to catch sight of this. And Mrs. Jennings, having seen both of her daughters successfully married, now devoted her spare time to imagining matches between every eligible gentleman and lady. She had, she claimed, quite an excellent skill at prediction, and mark her words, Colonel Brandon and Marianne were meant to be. She told Marianne later, when visiting the Dashwoods' cottage, that she had seen it from the moment he had watched her at the piano, and hadn't she noted that he always begged her to play after that? He was evidently in love, and what a match it would be, seeing as he was rich and she was pretty. Marianne, however, was far from convinced. But surely you jest, she ventured. Mrs. Jennings assured her that she never jested, not when it came to matters as serious as those of the heart, and that this was a match, and a serious one. But he's ancient, Marianne railed. Mrs. Dashwood bristled. He's only 5 years younger than I am. Exactly, said Marianne, old enough to be my father. And even if he was once capable of passion, he must surely have outlived that possibility now. Didn't you hear him complain about his rheumatism? Isn't that the first sign of getting old? I suppose you think I'm lucky to be alive at all, then, said Mrs. Dashwood, feeling very much withered, at least under her daughter's critical gaze. I didn't say he was about to die, declared Marianne, missing the point. But he's still too old to marry, at least for me. Well, if he were about to die, you'd probably want him, said Margaret, with rather more insight than was warranted in one so young. The quick pulse of the fever, agreed Elinor, her mind at one with her sister's. The romance of the flushed cheek. Marianne rolled her eyes. He talked about flannel waistcoats. Flannel waistcoats. That's precisely the kind of thing old men wear. Besides, he's already had one attachment, and you know very well I cannot entertain the possibility that a heart can love twice. Elinor protested again and at length, as did her mother, who was, of course, Henry Dashwood's second attachment, and Mrs. Jennings, who believed in any and all attachments. But though Marianne would admit to his kindness and taste, for he had liked her music after all, she could not and would not admit he might be a match. Besides, she said to her mother, once Mrs. Jennings had gone back to Barton Park and Elinor to bed, it's Edward Ferrars you should be thinking about. Where on earth is he? Where indeed? For the Dashwoods had been at Barton Cottage for weeks now, with no word from him at all. What if he's ill? Imagined Marianne. Dying, even. It will be nothing of the sort, said Mrs. Dashwood. I didn't expect him so soon anyway. He's a very busy man. A very, very busy man. or so she told herself. Just as she told herself that although he had not made his intentions regarding Elinor entirely clear, and his goodbye to her was perhaps more of a brotherly kind, their match at least was as good as made. Chapter 7. The Dashwoods had been settled at Barton Cottage for more than a month, when another gentleman, if he can be called that, and a rival to the Colonel, was introduced into their increasing circle. This time, however, the occasion was not a party, but something rather more perilous. With autumn upon them, the weather was on the turn, but this did not stop Marianne taking daily walks down to the estuary or up on the moor. It was there, she claimed, that her passions were at their highest, surrounded by powerful nature. Plus, she had seen a rather fancy mansion in Allenheim, and had taken to spending swaths of time imagining who might live there. Those clouds look powerful enough, said Mrs. Dashwood, as Marianne buttoned her cloak and bustled Margaret into her boots. Are you sure the two of you should be going out? I welcome the rain, replied Marianne, as Mrs. Dashwood had feared she might. The tender drops, the wash of it all, it is most mesmerizing. Neither Mrs. Dashwood nor Elinor, who had tried warnings of her own, bothered to say anything further, for there was no telling Marianne what to do at the best of times. And so, with the clouds bunched blackly on the horizon, and the tang of storm on the sea air, the younger sisters set off for the hills. What wonder! Called Marianne as the wind whipped in her faces. There is nothing in the world better than this. Are you sure this is sensible? Asked Margaret, who, despite her sense of adventure, was none too keen on the darkening sky. I think it would be better to head back. Nonsense, replied Marianne, who had no time for sense, only beauty. We shall walk for at least 2 hours. I pity Elinor for missing it. And on they marched, until, less than 20 minutes later, the full force of rain pelted them in their faces, and with no shelter in sight, they were forced to abandon the plan and head back at speed, not an easy task given the slope of the hills and its increasing slickness. Wait for me, called Margaret, as Marianne ran ahead. She needn't have asked, for no sooner had she spoken than Marianne tripped and tumbled, falling several feet down a steep ravine. Marianne! Wailed Margaret. Are you all right? Shall I fetch help? Allow me, came a voice. Margaret turned, and to her surprise found herself confronted by quite the most dashing man she had seen in her life. Here, he said, handing Margaret his gun. A hunter, then, so definitely dashing. And with that he descended the perilous slope with ease, picked up Marianne, who made not a murmur of protest, and carried her over his shoulder all the way back to Barton Cottage, the gobsmacked Margaret scampering in his wake. Mrs. Dashwood and Elinor were no less entranced. As the group entered, they both stood, their mouths slightly agape. Of course, any kindness to Marianne would have been greeted with gratitude, but something about his handsome face, his impeccable manners, the cut of his cloak, made it seem all the more generous. No, gallant. Oh, thank you, cried Mrs. Dashwood. Please do sit down. You must be exhausted. That's too kind, said the gentleman, but I'm wet through and would hate to soak your face. Perhaps I may call tomorrow, though, to check on your daughter's health? Or is she your sister? Oh, Mrs. Dashwood giggled. My daughter, of course. And please do, Mr. Willoughby, finished for her. Willoughby of Allenheim. Willoughby, repeated Marianne to herself as she settled into bed that evening. A fine name for a fine man. In fact, one might say he was equal to any hero in a storybook, to any leading man she had ever conjured up for herself. He was dashing, handsome, and he was connected to the manner she had admired. Perhaps, she imagined, even its heir. Yes, Willoughby was the one for her. Not old Colonel Brandon with his rheumatism and his flannel waistcoats, but young and thrusting Willoughby in his shooting coat, the uniform, surely, of the very best of men. So we're going to stop there for today. I hope you have enjoyed the beginning of Sense and Sensibility, and tune in tomorrow for some more readings. So have a good day, my friends, and thank you for listening.